Now I'm building up the subtle edges, turning the forms. I'm trying to make the mouth look like it's turning around to the other side of the head, as well as turning upward from the forward edge of the lip into the interior of the mouth where the back edge of the lip is. I'm jumping about in the picture space now, solidifying the darker markings. I'm pushing them to the point where they would almost be considered accents, so they're very dark. And they've set up, or they are setting up, my maximum range between the lightest light and the darkest dark, or the lighter side of the head and the shadowy side of the head. What kind of contrast does this picture have within it? The halftones that I'm pushing in here, she is fairly tan. She is not light and alabaster. The very beginning of the picture, I left all of those tones out. And sometimes a picture is better stated when you leave all these bits of information out. However, for the learning experience, and because these are all defining realism or three-dimensional form, I'm taking the shading as far as I can, possibly to the point of breaking some of the drawings. And in the case of this DVD, because female forms are supposed to be more elegant looking, a few of the drawings I did take too far and I brought them back around. And I will make mention of that when it happens. My theory is that a learning experience should incorporate errors as well. Not that I am deliberately making errors, but I know that I'm human and I'm just going to automatically make them. I'm going to admit when I make them, though, when other artists, I think, don't. They just tell you that it's a part of the plan, it's a part of the working process, and keep motoring through. They don't want to admit when they've done something wrong because it shows them to be human. They can actually make an error, and they're not all that magical. Well, I'm human, and I know art can be very magical at the same time, but for a learning lesson, I think it is really important that you see things mess up, things fall over and flatten out, and the recovery for that as well. As I'm getting into these smaller areas, I'm changing up my grip again. I'm holding the pencil between my index finger and my middle finger. I'm using my thumb as the guide, so my fingers aren't actually pressing very hard on the pencil. The weight of the pencil is taking over the mark making, and my hand is just being utilized as a guide to spin the pencil tip around in different places to fill in the spaces. And I'm being more meticulous in these tighter areas to build up the insertion points where a lot of things meet each other, like at the corner of the mouth and at the corner of the eye. When I'm working on the perimeter of the face, as I'm doing right now, I work into the background. And you can see that I was working on the background and I made it a little darker so that when I fill in the tones in the face, they blend right into that background and they blend into a darker atmosphere. The background needs to be darker in order for the face to feel like the values are lighter within it than any place else. For making hair, I'm building in these larger, darker patches. And I'm trying as hard as I can, not necessarily to go with the weave of the hair, meaning that I'm not building fibers. I'm not building individual hairs. I'm building the same way I do in the face plane, and I'm building up patches of tone, both light and dark patches. And as these patches get built up to a certain point, before I move on into the detailing phase, the patches need to be the correct distance and value apart from each other. And then after that, details can be added. So a detail is nothing more than a few extra visible lines that produce an illusion of texture. And those lines are passed over areas that are usually in the highlights. That's where you want the straightest lines or the stiffest lines to pass through, because when you pass them through the dark areas, you just don't notice them as easily. And the idea here is to imply texture and not to overdevelop something, meaning that, like with hair, there's hundreds and thousands of hairs within every square inch. And that's obviously a big number there. There's thousands of hairs within a few square inches of our head. And for us to draw all of those hairs, first of all, it's ridiculous to even think of that. And secondly, a painting is not about replicating every single fiber that we see in front of us. It's creating illusions. And the strongest illusions are usually the most implied. I'll refer back to Sargent again one of the strongest artists that implied everything very, very well, thoughtfully and minimally, and created some of the strongest illusions out there. And this is implied. The opposite end of the spectrum would be Rubens or even Bouguereau or Jean Leon Gérôme, where they worked really, really hard. They labored over everything, and yet did it in an effortless way and made it feel just beyond accessible to most, right? But also, I think, to the highest degree and order of magic that an artist can possibly do. And then the only other person above that whole stacking or pecking order would be Rembrandt. And he truly is the master of illusion. He expressed paint so much more diversely than any other artist in the history of art. That's not to say that other artists have not pushed those boundaries too. Richard Schmid is another artist who's pushed just about every artistic boundary possible. But as far as a body of work is concerned and as far as originality is concerned, it's kind of hard to put a modern artist at the forefront, because really all of the art was originated back in the day, or all of the techniques of art were originated back in the day. And all we've been doing ever since is chasing them. We've been chasing back to get to realism. We've been chasing back to get to a better impression. Impressionism is all art. Every bit of painting that we ever did, do, and will ever do is impressionable. There is no such thing as one being realistic and the other one being less realistic. It's all an impression. Everything that we do is an illusion. That's all an impression. We need to better define what it is that makes art what it is, so that people don't get too confused. I hear Jean-Leon Gérôme being called a realist, when in reality you look at those surfaces and they're painted and they're spontaneous. They are very impressionable. Although the brushstrokes are shorter, smaller, tighter, and blended together more, it's still an impression at the end of the day. We're not copying things like a photograph makes a photographic impression. We're not a photograph. We're not replicating reality in that sense. We're doing it a different way. We are impressionists. At every level of what we do, we're an impressionist of sorts. All right, I'm starting to drop in the darkest accents into the picture now, and these are areas where I want the values to sink even deeper into the page, because I don't have a full value range as of yet. These darker values are pushing me to that point. The light end of the spectrum has obviously been capped. The white of the paper, or the lightness of the paper, is about as bright as we're going to be able to go. I could pull out some white charcoal and go even lighter, but there's no sense in doing that, because there really isn't anything in this picture that's purely white. But the dark end of the spectrum had not been defined yet, or had not been set clearly. Now I have a range that I can push towards. And as I put these darker markings into the picture, I also need to keep aware of the sense of balance between lights and darks, and not become overburdened or over heavy-handed with the darks, over marking them or over placing them, putting too many of them in the picture space, when in actuality they should be played down a little bit. If I'm going to keep her hair glowing, if I'm going to keep her hair looking like it's lit, and glowing basically just means along the highlighted edge, if I'm going to keep that illusion there, I cannot go too dark in that space, because light is hitting her, and she doesn't have purely black hair. Her hair is actually brown, and so there wouldn't be a need for pushing everything totally black, unless she was in an extremely dark room with a very concentrated light source on a very small part of her face, or a very small part of her head. The halftones that I'm putting into the picture now, I can push a little bit darker, because those dark marks in the hair are opening up the range of values for me to work with in the face. So almost every design that you've seen me do so far in these demos, they've all been, for the most part, top lit. So the place I go to first with the halftones is the bottom half of the skull and the neck, the furthest points away from the light source. If I start the darks or the halftones down there, I'm logically applying the values the way the light source is falling over the model. The lights are going to be more concentrated at the top of the head, less halftones. There's going to be more halftones at the bottom of the head where there is less light. And what we try to do when we're building in an academic order is we're trying to build everything up in a linear spatial division, step 1, step 2, step 3, linear process. And if we were to say that within the halftone stage of the drawing, if we were to take the halftones and start them somewhere, we would want to connect them to the last stage of the drawing, which would be the darks. So anywhere I have dark edges, I'm going to go back along there and apply the halftones. And the halftones are going to pull away from those dark edges and start to populate the rest of the light spaces. So the first place to go would be the neck, the jaw, the back of the jaw near the ear, the chin. Getting those values rolling and getting them turned under so that the head starts to appear curvilinear or spherical, rather than it just being a series of shapes all stuck together variously. And then I would work my way up towards the highlights in the forehead and the front of the face. The light source in this instance is to the right, and it is lighting her 3/4 edge, right where the pencil is to the right of the pencil tip. That edge is the highlighted edge. It's the 3/4 barrier along the side of the head. And that is the area that wants to be the brightest. So the front of the face, as it's rolling away from us, is getting darker. And the side of the face, as it's rolling away from the light, is getting darker. And both of them are getting darker at about the same rate. They're both dark values getting darker as they move away from our eye. One side, if we were to paint this with color, one side would be warmer, getting darker, and the other side would be cooler, getting darker, because of their placement in space in orientation to the light source and the bounce light, what's directly ahead of us, what's to the left of us, and to the right of us. Atmosphere is a weird animal like that, and it can play all sorts of tricks on us, deceiving us into thinking that we're seeing things a certain way. But once you start to apply color to the picture, that really helps translate what things go where, what temperatures go where, what colors go where, organizing the picture space so that we truly do have a 3D representational or realistic depiction of what we see out in front of us. Where with charcoal or with a soft media where we're using just one color, we don't have much of a choice. Things are going to look very similar going away from us in both directions. And color is just the next best thing that really helps clarify any other confusion that there might be. When I apply the halftones, I apply them not just in any sort of random fashion, as it almost appears because of how fast my hand is moving around the pad, but I apply it in structural blocks, little patches that we would call tiles, if we were to build a mosaic. But we'll go ahead and use that term here because we have to define what each patch of tone is called. I could call them patches, but that's a little confusing. So we're going to call them tiles. And that word tile is indicative of mosaics, which is sort of what we're building here. If you think about building this picture one surface at a time, if we're going to roll her head surface by surface by surface, we're building each facet, we're building each tile, we're rolling the forms in space, we're building a mosaic. Thus the term tiling. And you'll hear it a lot more when you're painting, because with paint you put down swatches of color that tend to be large or graphic-like in little tiled blocks. And that's the more appropriate way of spelling it out. The tiles that we're defining here, we're building in patches with little strands of hatch lines that create that patch or that surface space. But regardless of the materials and the approach to making those particulars happen, they are what they are. We're building lots of little facets that bleed together and hopefully overlap each other just enough to create the sensation of continuation or a continuous form. Continuous transition from one side to another. The problem with halftones and the problem with using your fingers, in addition to putting oils into the paper and having a very difficult time removing those markings, is that the finger tends to bunch up tones, or especially when we're using charcoal. Imagine pushing your fingertip into the page, and the very first part of your finger that hits the charcoal is the tip of your finger. So as you push it along, it's acting like a shovel and it's scooping more charcoal into the tip. When you go to put your fingertip down somewhere else in the drawing and smudge that tone, you might end up with a very, very dark fingerprint right in the middle of a light space. That is what I'm dancing around with my hand right now. And that's why I'm kind of doing the over defined and extreme way of pushing my finger into the forehead to soften it. I'm really trying hard not to let my finger settle into the page and create a fingerprint. That fingerprint is going to be so darn hard to remove, especially at this late stage of the game, having so many other tones on the surface. It's not worth it. And I've done that before. I've been there, done that, and I'm trying really hard not to go there again. It sucks. It sucks really bad to get a drawing as far as you've gotten, and then all of a sudden tear a hole in it. And that's basically what this dark spot would become on your page. Theoretically, if you can't remove it, it's basically a hole in the picture now. And it's really tough to get around that hole unless you make something else up. Like, for example, she just got done gardening and she has dirt smudged all over her face. You can't justify that, though, in a picture unless you put a little garden rake in her hand and you put a plant in her other hand. Then we might believe that what you have on her face is a smudge that's supposed to be dirt or something. Otherwise, it's a mark that is not going to go away and it is going to be the thing that we always stare at on that page. And here I'm tending to the smaller markings that the finger accidentally created, the little spots on the cheek that I don't really want there. I want them to be a part of the bigger fabric of tone across the entire face. So that means going in and doing microsurgery in small places using the very tip of the pencil to pick out and add in little tiny patches of tone to join the other little aggressive patches of tone back into the whole. We call the whole in a drawing the matrix. It's all the spaces where things need to be defined: light, dark, sharp, soft, and anything in between: warm, cool, colorful, when we add paint to the equation. And the matrix is easily broken when you forget about a space and you do something different to it, or you just don't put something in, or you make things too graphic, too cut apart, non-existent, fading out too fast. There are so many things that you can do to a picture to ruin the matrix or the overall context of the picture space. And that's why you go to art school, because you learn about all these different things so that you have greater control over the elements, so that you have greater control over when something breaks, you will know how to fix it. If you've never learned a tool, then when something breaks, you either avoid it and continue going on anyway. You don't notice that it's broken, or you do notice that it's broken, and because you don't have an answer to how to fix it, you just let it go. We don't want to do that, especially when we're making art that's supposed to be beautiful or fully realized, or when we're doing something for a client. We can't just let things go. We have to address it all. All right, so I'm winding down to the little details now. I don't have as much big stuff to do. If there's any big stuff to do, it would be to add strands of hair to the outside perimeter of the head, soften edges into the background, soften edges into each other within the pictorial space if things feel too aggressive and cut out. But there is no more addition to. I'm not going to be adding any more stuff to the picture because right now there is a healthy balance between the lights and the darks. If I introduce any new shapes, it breaks the entire composition and I will have to go to work struggling to figure out how to balance things out. So the idea now is just to massage what's left, make it all work just right and get it to blend together so that nothing feels too cut out, too masculine in this case, because it just shouldn't be, and or unfinished to any extent, any greater extent. The bottom half of the picture will look unfinished. That's a part of what's called the vignette. I'm not going to finish it down there because I'm letting it go purposefully. But anything within the picture area that I have committed to, I should commit fully to and completely realize it or resolve it. If I have done that with one small space within the entire area, I have to do that with all the spaces. And then there's judgment, which things to play up and which things to tone back so that you don't end up overdoing everything. And this should just about wrap it up. I have a couple little things to do just to patch up some spaces that got a little blurry. And that's about it. Oh, we can't forget the signature. Cannot forget the signature. I can't forget who did this drawing.